Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you all with where I've been. We're going to get right into the video.
At the very edge of Long Island in Montauk, New York, sits a decommissioned military base called Camp Hero.
Obviously, the mad scientists that were already working on the Phoenix Project couldn't just stop their research. They decided that they would continue their operations in the secluded Montauk Air Force Base.
3, 2, 1.
Hi, I'm Weird History Gal, also known as Josie, and I make videos about history and all things peculiar, mainly focused on the Long Island and New York areas because that is where I'm from. I started a series in 2021 about the Montauk Project. My first video was all about the creation of the project and what events led up to it. And it has been on hiatus for a little bit, but I'm finally back today with video 1.5, which is going to be all about the story of Preston B. Nichols. He co-authored the books with Peter Moon and was the first person to come out alleging this story of the Montauk Project. He claimed to have been a radar technician and also a director on the Montauk Project and had been living a double life essentially and was totally unaware consciously of his involvement in the Montauk Project until he recovered his memories years later after the project took place. And again, I will explain this whole thing. The Montauk Project is the book series that Stranger Things was said to be based on. Stranger Things was in fact originally going to be called Montauk and based in Montauk on Long Island. As I did say in my first video, I am not claiming 100% that this whole story happened. I enjoy this book series and the story itself for entertainment purposes. Definitely think that there are certain aspects of it that are not outside of the realm of possibility, but I just don't necessarily know if they specifically happened. So in part one, I did go over the Philadelphia experiment and the Phoenix Project, as well as went over some relevant people in this whole story. So definitely go check out that video before you watch this one if you want some background and you don't necessarily know a lot about this whole thing. So Preston Nichols was born on Long Island on May 24th, 1946. He was an electrical engineer and claimed to have a classified degree in quantum electrodynamics, which I suppose qualified him for becoming a radar technician on the Montauk Project. So in 1971, Preston began working at a defense contractor. In the Montauk Project book series, he does call this defense contractor BJM, but openly admits in the books that this is a fictitious name. And I was able to find interviews of him saying that he worked at the defense contractor AIL on Long Island. So, you know, he later admitted what defense contractor it was. While working at AIL, he obtained a grant to study telepathy and sought to disprove it. He was shocked when his research was leading him to the conclusion that telepathy did exist and that thought waves behaved almost like radio waves. So fast forward to 1974, his research with telepathy has led him to working with a group of psychics, and he finds that no matter who it is, at the same time every day, the psychics would get jammed up and transmissions would stop. So they would stop getting their psychic intuitions at the same time every day without fail. So because he was an electronics engineer, he decides to try to trace any type of a signal that might be going on in the atmosphere that could be causing this. So he claims to put some type of equipment on top of his car to figure out if this is occurring. And he found that whenever a 410 to 420 megahertz cycle would appear on the air, that is when the psychics would get jammed up. And once it would stop, they would open back up and be receptive again after about 20 minutes. So he decides to go a step further and use his equipment to find where the signal is coming from. And it leads him to Montauk Point, specifically to Camp Hero. So in his conscious mind, from what I gather, this is the first time that he sees the Sage radar tower and he knows that this is where the signal is coming from. He goes up to the gates and finds the base heavily guarded and is told by a guard there that a radar project is being run by the FAA and that he cannot enter, he's gotta go. So a valid question some of you might ask is, why didn't this guard know who he was if he was taking part in the Montauk Project? Even if he wasn't consciously aware of it in his normal life, how could the guard not have recognized him? And I will say, I'm not 100% vouching for the validity of his story, but he did claim that he got involved in the Montauk Project in 1974, so that does explain why the guard might not have recognized him. He might not have actually been a part of the project yet. So that actually consciously and unconsciously might have been the first time he ever was going up to Camp Hero and seeing the radar tower for the first time. So in his normal waking life, he doesn't go back to Camp Hero until a full decade later in 1984, when he gets a phone call from a buddy who tells him that the Montauk Air Force Base has been abandoned and he wants to go check it out. So Preston goes back to Camp Hero and claims that the way the base was left was not the way the military would normally leave a base. He says that debris was strewn everywhere. He finds papers all over the ground and a fire extinguisher, and he claims that the gates and windows were all left open. He finds a lot of high voltage equipment within, I believe, the building with the big radar tower, but he's interested in buying the equipment for himself because, again, he is an electronics engineer and I suppose he wanted to do some kind of work with it. He believes his equipment has been abandoned, so his way of going about buying it is to contact the Surplus Disposal Agency in Michigan, and he speaks to a woman there who said she's going to see what she can do. He ends up not hearing from her for a few weeks, so he contacts her back and she says to him that she's having trouble because both the military and the General Services Administration have both not claimed to know anything about this equipment. So in order for him to buy it, somebody has to claim it. So she puts him in contact with a man who works at a military overseas terminal in Bayonne, New Jersey, who she claims should be able to help him. This man in New Jersey gives Preston the same story. We take the story at face value. This man had some type of authority because he ends up giving Preston a document that he says will allow Preston to take whatever equipment he wants from the base. And he says if anybody gives you a hard time there, just show them this. And he also does refer Preston to the Camp Hero caretaker so that the caretaker can show Preston around. So Preston returns to the base, and this is where the mystery begins to ensue. So Preston goes back to Camp Hero intent on picking up this equipment and is accompanied by a friend who he calls Brian in the books, who he says is a psychic. When they get to Camp Hero, Brian and Preston kind of go their separate ways. They're both exploring the base, and Preston ends up coming across a man who appears to be homeless. He claims that a crazy experiment took place at the base a year prior and that he's been there ever since. He says that he worked as a technician on this experiment and he went AWOL right before the project ended. He claims that the base was abandoned by all military personnel when a beast materialized on the base, and that wasn't even his craziest claim because he followed that up by telling Preston that he recognized him and that Preston had been his boss on this project. Preston writes off this man's claims as that this man was just insane and meets back up with his friend Brian, who he does end up asking to do a reading on the base. Preston is surprised to hear that Brian reports the same type of strange phenomena and specifically mentions a beast that materialized on the base out of nowhere. He also reports strange weather patterns, strange animal behavior, and most notably, mind control experiments, he said, had taken place there during this crazy experiment. So Preston is tipped off a tiny bit at that point to the fact that something peculiar had happened at the base, whether or not he was involved. He's starting to pick up on the fact that something isn't right here, something bad seems to have happened, especially because he was clued in initially by the fact that the base was left so abruptly, it seemed. Okay, I will just slip in here because you've probably inevitably noticed that I'm wearing a different top than I was wearing the last frame. This sweatshirt, as well as a few other products with this same Camp Hero design on it, will be available on my clothing line website, weirdhistoryshop.com, on September 8th at 10 a.m. If you are interested in it, if you like it, just slipping that in there. Anyway, back to the story. So Preston was able to obtain a lot of the equipment that was left over at Camp Hero that was used during the Montauk Project, and he brought it back to his lab. He claims that a few weeks later, a man walked straight into his lab, which was at the back of his house, so that was weird that the man knew exactly where it was located. And he walked in and claimed the same thing as the homeless man at Camp Hero, that Preston had been his boss on this shady military project, and Preston again had no idea what this man was talking about. He doesn't give any other conclusion to this situation other than the fact that it drove the point home for him that he needed to investigate what had actually happened at Montauk and that he was sure he had some involvement, but he obviously didn't know what at that point. So it spurred him into camping out in Montauk for a week and asking locals about what they might know, asking the local police what they might know, asking everyone what they might know. And he again had some strange findings. 6 people specifically reported that it had snowed in the middle of August, hurricane force winds would just appear out of nowhere, and thunderstorms, lightning, and hail would appear under unusual circumstances, which I'm sure if you're local to Long Island, you know that that doesn't really sound like anything out of the ordinary. That tends to happen here pretty frequently, but I digress. The locals also reported strange animal behavior, like animals coming into the town en masse, animals jumping off the edge of Montauk Point. They also reported that animals would just go crazy and crash through windows. So again, other living things besides people seem to have been being affected by whatever weird stuff was going on in Montauk. Preston also spoke to a police chief who reported the same types of strange behavior, but in humans. He specifically said that crime tended to happen in 2-hour windows, as well as teens congregating and disbanding in the town. Both of these things seem to happen in 2-hour windows throughout the day. So his camping trip in Montauk only confirmed for him that something very weird was going on. He didn't have any answers yet about his own involvement, but he was slowly adding details to this picture of what had happened at Montauk. He continued being recognized by people he didn't know, and he specifically said that he would travel to ham fests, which, if you're not familiar, ham radio equipment is a type of radio equipment. And more people would recognize him even at these ham fests where he would go to obtain more equipment. In 1984, a man named Duncan Cameron showed up on Preston's doorstep, much like the other man who had just barged right into Preston's lab, so I guess Duncan was a little bit more polite. And he told Preston that he needed help with a piece of audio equipment. If you don't know this name already, Duncan Cameron also ends up playing a significant part in this whole story, but instead of giving you an info dump, I'll just continue to let the story unravel. At the time that Duncan visited him, he was still working with that same group of psychics that he had originally started working with when he started researching telepathy, and he found that Duncan immediately gelled really well with the psychics and found Duncan's enthusiasm too good to be true and decides to bring him to Camp Hero on a hunch, I guess wondering if Duncan might have also been involved in the Montauk Project. And to no one's surprise, Duncan ends up being aware of the purpose of each building and knowing information that somebody who was just going there for the first time couldn't have known. So Duncan and Preston go back to Preston's house, and Preston claims that he deprogrammed Duncan. And through this deprogramming, he discovers that Duncan was sent to his lab to befriend him, unalive him, and then blow up his lab. I suppose after Preston broke this brainwashing, Duncan was horrified at what he had been sent there to do and vowed to help Preston, and the two continued to work together after that. And Preston found that Duncan was an incredibly good psychic, which I'm going to be getting more into Duncan, especially when it comes to the experiments of the Montauk Project. But Duncan, if you're not already aware, was the brother of Al Bielek. They were essentially time travelers. I go over their story in video 1 more in depth, and I can totally talk about it in another video if you guys are interested. I don't think I went into it too deeply. But Duncan also had a background in intelligence. He was trained supposedly by the NSA to remote view. So again, all of that to say very briefly, he was a very advanced psychic. So Preston continues in his daily life to come across people that he starts to get a hunch might have been involved in the Montauk Project, and he would bring them to Camp Hero. They would also have the same revelation that they were involved in something weird there, accumulating this small group of people that, again, he believes were involved in the Montauk Project with him. In 1986, Preston gave an unannounced lecture at the U.S. Psychotronics Association all about the information he has gathered so far that he believes happened during the Montauk Project, and he claims that it created an uproar. He did this to not only spread awareness, but also hopefully ensure his safety, because with the nature of what supposedly happened during the Montauk Project, it was obviously top secret, and by default had to be dangerous for him to be speaking out about. So after giving this lecture at the U.S. Psychotronics Association, Preston decides to go the route of contacting the federal government to get justice, it seems, more than anything, or to let somebody know who might be able to do something about what had happened. So he doesn't mention this man's name in the books. He just mentions that this man was former Air Force and a senator from the Southwest. Preston had mentioned a man named Senator Goldwater in a talk that he did about the Montauk Project, and the senator, he had said, had given some type of conference or a talk about what had happened at Montauk. So that is my own speculating that he was talking about Senator Barry Goldwater, who was from Arizona and was former Air Force. So again, I don't know if I'm right about that, and he doesn't mention this man's name in the books, but that is my own speculation. The senator did an investigation and found that military technicians had been assigned to Camp Hero after the base was decommissioned in 1969, so obviously that made no sense. He was particularly interested, for good reason, in where the funding for the project came from, and at the conclusion of his investigation, he was unable to find any evidence of funding, any evidence of appropriations, and any evidence of oversight committees. Preston became quiet about the Montauk story in order to not jeopardize the senator's investigation, but it did conclude in the early 1990s. So in the early 1990s, also when the Montauk Project came out in 1992, that is when the senator gave Preston the green light to talk about the project again. So rewinding back about 3 years to when Preston is continually recognized by people he doesn't know, he is also starting to find it incredibly suspicious that he has a full set of normal memories to account for where he'd been. So Preston came to the conclusion that he must be living in some sense on another time track, and his only option was to unblock these repressed memories. So going back to 1989, Preston began to explore the locations he would go in his waking life to see if he could find any clues as to this alternate timeline he seemed to be living on where he worked on the Montauk Project. So he begins to explore the plant that he works at AIL to see if he can find any clues to what might be going on. So he began doing this by just walking around and observing his intuitive reactions to different areas of the plant. And it leads him to this one room that he feels a very strong aversion to, and he tries to enter it only to find that the room is locked and he's told that you need clearance to enter it. After asking around, he finds 2 people who have the security clearance to enter that room, but after speaking to them, it seems that they out him to security because he is visited by security shortly after. A year later, in 1990, Preston finds this room with the doors open, so he enters it and finds that the whole room has been cleared, though he does see evidence that equipment had been in the room in marks on the wall and whatnot. He finds an elevator at the back of the room. Once in the elevator, he discovers that there are only 2 floors available for the person inside, which is the main floor and the subfloor, and there is also a numbered keypad. Preston ends up pressing the button for the subfloor, but finds that the elevator will only go down so far. I remember in the book, this wasn't really elaborated on, so I'm guessing that it went down a little bit and then came back up. And he says that he feels an inkling to punch in a numbered code. So he tries a few codes that come to his mind, none of them work, and he is eventually escorted out of the room by security. Another strange thing that Preston noticed while working at AIL is that band-aids would appear on his hand out of the blue. He remembered eventually that in his alternative life, he would often have to move heavy equipment that nobody else could move because it would make their brains go a little bit haywire. So for whatever reason, he was the only person equipped to move this heavy equipment, which was the reason for the band-aids appearing on his hands all the time. He started asking the nurse about these band-aids whenever they would appear to make sure that she wasn't the one that gave them to him, and every time she would confirm that she was not the one that gave him the band-aid. And eventually she seemed to get tipped off to the fact that something weird was going on, or maybe she, you know, in this reality knew of his alternative life and knew he wasn't supposed to know about it. So she did, for whatever reason, tip off security as well, and he was again visited by security. So you can probably infer at this point he was a liability in the making. So as Preston was becoming more aware of this alternative life he was living, although he didn't know the entirety of it, memories were beginning to bleed through. Okay, so don't mind my third outfit change. I filmed the rest of this video on my phone yesterday because my Canon battery died like 3 times while I was filming this, only to find that that video was corrupted when I tried to transfer the video to my laptop today, so I'm refilming it right now. Anyway, back to the story. So another weird thing that happened around this time was that Preston claimed his memory one morning was spurred back to an event that happened in 1978. I don't know if there's an event that correlates with this that I'm missing, but it was a very specific year for him to point out without much context, because he says that at 9 a.m. and then 4 p.m. he smelled burning transformers, and the smell disappeared so quickly that it seemed impossible basically, so it was almost like a hallucinatory smell that he was experiencing. Going along with the reality of this story, if you know, we're gonna believe all of it, he must have looked to see if anything was burning around him and it wasn't. So again, it was just very unplausible. I don't know what 1978 really has to do with that. I don't know, again, if there's an event that I'm missing that correlates to it, but if we think about his timeline in terms of when he was taking part in the Montauk Project, he says that he got involved around 1974 and he was involved until the end in 1983. So he's basically implying, from what I gather, that he was experiencing in his normal time track an event that happened while he was taking part in the Montauk Project. So that was another weird thing that happened to him. Unfamiliar people continue to recognize him. We know that this is a reoccurring theme at this point. It was happening a lot. He also began to receive mail that would normally be reserved for an executive in a company. He was also invited to conferences concerning certain patents, and with a specific executive. He doesn't name the executive. I haven't been able to find who this executive might have been in my own research. He claims that this mail all had to do with a project called the Moonbeam Project, which I've never seen the Montauk Project referred to outside of the Montauk Project book series as Project Moonbeam. So if any of you know anything about that, definitely leave it in the comments. So one of the biggest breakthroughs that Preston had was when he decided in about 1990 to go into the basement of the building that he worked in at AIL, which was a very high security area. And he does mention in the books, I believe, that this building was in Melville. He walked into this high security area and approached the guards and fully expected them to turn him away. But to his surprise, he handed his badge to them and they handed him back another badge with his name on it, as if he belonged there. So this threw him off. So he enters this area in the basement that again is high security. He starts looking around briefly and he finds an office that has a nameplate on it that says Preston B. Nichols, Assistant Project Director, which is his first proof in the physical world that he is taking part in some kind of shady military experiment that he's not consciously aware of. So he claims that he sits in his office for a few hours, he reads through the documents that are in there. He even claims in the books that a lot of what is in the documents he can't even mention in the books. It's like too top secret. So he leaves his office after that. He tries to go back to this office days later, only to find that his office has been cleared and his nameplate removed, and he is told by a director that is working down there already that he has no business being there. He is aware somebody must have realized that he entered his office when he wasn't supposed to while he was in his normal state of mind, and the program, quote unquote, wasn't turned on. Which reminds me of the way that the personality splits with victims of MK Ultra, how they have different personalities that can be switched on through certain signals. And that's not to conflate MK Ultra with the Montauk Project. MK Ultra, as a lot of you probably know, is a declassified project that actually happened. The Montauk Project has not been verified. Again, seeing as this whole thing concerns mind control so heavily, it's definitely tangible to me within the world of the Montauk Project that he could have been a victim of something like MK Ultra. And this alternative personality was a prerequisite to him entering that office. So if somebody knew that he wasn't in that frame of mind, perhaps the person who was the one that would switch him back and forth, they would know that he was starting to realize this alternative life in his normal time track. So he was told afterward by security that if he spoke of what he'd seen in his office, he would be thrown in jail. So he was sworn to secrecy. So Preston knew beyond a doubt at that point that he was living on 2 separate timelines or time tracks. He had this whole other alternative life where he was working on the Montauk Project that he still was not fully aware of. He wasn't necessarily sure what he was doing there, what his role was. He just knew that he was a prominent part of it. In 1990 still, he was able to recover almost all of his other memories when he was working on a Delta T antenna on his roof, which that's also weird that he was just on his roof, but I guess, I don't know, if any of you work on radio equipment, let me know if this might be normal. And also, if you know anything about Delta T antennas, feel free to leave your input in the comments. I don't know anything about them, but in the Montauk Project books, Preston claims that this type of an antenna could bend time. So as he was working on it on his roof, he was soldering loops into relay boxes. Again, that's what he states. And there was a storm coming, so I suppose there was more electricity in the atmosphere. And while he was working on the antenna, he slowly began to uncover all of the repressed memories in his subconscious. He states that he didn't recover all of them at that point, but that all of his key memories came back to him as he worked on it. And as he worked on this same antenna throughout the future, he recovered more and more of his memories. By June of 1990, he claims he had recovered all of his key memories of working on the project. And a month later, in July of 1990, he was laid off from AIL, which severed his connections to that world, at least temporarily. So that brings me full circle with explaining to you all how Preston came to uncover his memories of being a radar technician and playing the role of some sort of a director on the Montauk Project. My next video is going to be all about the experiments of the Montauk Project, so that's going to be a really fun video and the video that a lot of you have probably been waiting for. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and again, I feel the need to stress, this is an entertaining story. As I've been researching this, I've been reminded of how they sing the song Never Ending Story in Stranger Things, because this is a never-ending story. There are so many little rabbit holes to go down. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if there are any videos that you would like to see me make in the future, definitely let me know in the comments. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.